We're going to be learning about ecological succession up next on Gifted Guzman. Ecological succession is basically just a set of steps that takes something from rocks or soil to a whole forest or a whole ecosystem. We're going to talk about those steps today and look at how these things happen so that we can get to those places. You learned last year in the 6th grade about the rock cycle. So you know about igneous rock that comes up and the lava comes up to the surface and it cools and becomes an igneous rock. You've learned about sedimentary rocks that are piled on top of each other and compacted and cemented and become rock. So we have all of this rock on our planet. But what do we need for plants to grow? Yes, that's right. We need soil. We need soil for plants to grow, and this is not soil. So something needs to happen to these rocks in order to make them into soil. So there's something that's called weathering that happens to rocks. Weathering can happen by chemical means or by physical means. Physical means would be if the rocks are rubbing against each other, if the wind comes, if water comes, and it breaks them down into teeny tiny pieces, that's weathering. Another type of weathering is chemical weathering, and that's what we talk about often when we're talking about ecological succession. We talk about lichens and mosses. They're little tiny types of plants, and they have a chemical in them, and so they will come, and the little spores will come and land on these rocks, and they'll secrete this chemical, and it breaks down the rock and breaks it down and breaks it down into tiny pieces so that there's enough soil then for the lichens and mosses to take hold and to start growing. So those first lichens and mosses that come to these rocks and live on top of these rocks are called a pioneer species. So just like the pioneers back in the day, we think about the pioneers in history that came over from Europe and came to the United States. They were the first ones that came and lived here in the United States, what we now call the United States. We think of lichens and mosses as a pioneer species. They're the first species. They're the first organisms that come live on this abiotic rock. Remember, abiotic is non-living. So we have this rock where the magma has come up, or the rock has been formed over years and years from layers of sediment, or a glacier has pulled back and exposed some rock. And now we get these lichens and mosses that come up, and they are here for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. This takes a very, very long time because they're little tiny organisms, and it takes them a long time to break down something as big as a rock. And imagine big, big rocks out in nature, right? These are just little rocks that I have for my rock collection. So it takes them all this time, but eventually they get this nice soil, right? The rock has broken down, and it's broken down into soil and into sandy soil and silty soil. And now it's ready for plants to live there. But where did the plants come from? Well, remember when we learned in adaptation, plants can come from being stuck to an animal, right? So their seeds are stuck to an animal, and the animal comes by the area and it drops the seeds, and the seeds go down into the soil, and then they get rained on and they grow. Or some of them, remember, have adaptation so the wind can pick them up and they travel around by the wind and the wind drops them off, and they're able to get into the soil and grow. So what happens is these smaller plants, like grasses and little wildflowers, they begin to grow on the area. So we'll see them, and they're growing, and you may have seen a field somewhere out where you live, and you can see all these grasses and wildflowers just kind of growing in this field. So imagine that, okay? That's that next stage. Well, then we have all these nice little plants, and we're starting to get this nice little ecosystem with bugs and maybe some little mice and maybe some little rabbits. And then we get some more seeds that come in, and we get shrubs. So a shrub is like a small tree, right? It's like a bush. Think of like a bush or a small tree. So then we have those growing, and then we get some birds coming in and some snakes, right? And we're starting to build this ecosystem. Then along comes some more seeds because some more animals are coming to the area. They're bringing some more things. Maybe some more water is starting to travel through. The wind is bringing things through. And now we're growing up, and we're getting into the point where we have trees. Okay, and so for all this very, very, very long time, from rocks to lichens and mosses to grasses and wildflowers to bushes and shrubs to trees and to organisms, animal organisms coming in all along, Now we've had this succession. Succession means that we've had this series of steps that move us along to what we finally call a climax community. So a climax community is where the space is filled up. It's filled up with all of the organisms that it can handle, and it's in balance. It's got that homeostasis. Remember that balance? So there's enough predator, there's enough prey, there's enough producers, there's enough consumers. Everything is perfect and wonderful, right? And it's going along, and then what happens? Dun, dun, dun! Australian forest fire, tornado, hurricane, lava spewing out of a mountain, okay? Humans, deforestation, some traumatic event happened. When that happens, we go into what's called secondary succession. Okay, the first set of steps that we just went through, that's primary succession. The second set of steps, after some big natural disaster or some horrible event has happened to break everything up, is going to be called secondary succession. The nice thing about secondary succession is it's shorter because this is already turned into soil. And usually, even if there's a hurricane, if there's a flood, if there's a fire, there's still little bits of seeds and things down inside the soil, so we don't have to start from scratch from everything coming back. Things will start to sprout up and regrow back from that step where we're at grasses and wildflowers, and sometimes even we have some shrubs and stuff already that manage to survive, and they're just going to sprout back up. Okay, so secondary succession is much shorter. It's going to not require that you break rock down into soil. There's already going to be soil and things ready, and then you're going to move on and you're going to come back to the climax community at the end, and that's going to maintain until another disaster or something happens. That's all succession is. It's really super simple. It's just steps, and think of them from smallest to largest, right? From little bitty lichens and mosses that are teeny tiny, to grasses and flowers, to shrubs and bushes, to trees, to the climax community. Something happens and we start all over, okay? Really simply, that's ecological succession. I hope you enjoyed this video and learned something from it. I'm Gifted Guzman.